Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange, where we continue our discussion with Susan Shabangu, South Africa's Minister for Mineral Resources. Minister, before the break, we spoke about how to bring stability to the platinum sector. But a recent report, the benchmark report that came out, painted an incredibly grim picture of what is left in the wake of rich platinum mines, particularly its relationship with poor communities around. Are you satisfied, Minister, that mining companies like Lonmin and others are doing enough to actually deal with the consequences of inequality and poverty, particularly the feeder communities that feed it labor?
Definitely, no one can be happy in South Africa or satisfied with the situation around the mining industry. We know that we've inherited a sector which has a very, very negative past, and we're trying to work on that. But I must also say that the MPRDA, which is the Act, defines clearly how we need to interact and relate and improve conditions of the neighboring communities around mining situations. Not only that, we have the mining charter. Hence, in 2010, there was a review of the performance of the industry when it comes to meeting the targets set by the charter.
And how are they doing in terms of meeting those targets?
Not good at all. I must be upfront with that. They're not doing well. You still find that in 2010, we discovered that it was only 9% of performance. When you look, for instance, at the human resource development, when we talk about women, what they did, instead of looking women across color, they started placing with white women and say they're meeting their targets. But when you look at the demographics, you realize that no, it's just a twist. They are not there. So these are some of the issues which are real issues, are a real challenge. When you look at the targets set in terms of having living conditions within communities or within your mining jurisdictions, they're far from that, including Lonmin, including all of them, Impala. They are moving in that direction, but they're still far, and we think they can do more.
What are you going to do to compel them to do better?
Well, as part of compelling them, that is why we're amending the Act. Part of amending the Act, it's also trying to realign, because when we drafted the Act previously, it was not aligned to local government. That's what we're doing. We want them to work closely with local government, because it's in those communities where workers need to reside. But also what we've got to do, we must not commit mistakes of the past, where we create residential areas of purely mine workers, excluding the rest of the community, because you're also creating another problems. We want them to make sure they integrate mine workers into the real communities, build proper houses together and through the plan of the local economic development, and in that way you create a sustainable environment but sustainable communities. So we are looking at those things. We are strengthening the law where we'll compel them. We have time frames to say by 2014 they need to make sure that they comply. And if they are not going to do that, we are indeed going to come up with tougher measures. I know already they feel that we are impossible as a regulator, but we have to, because it's the workers who contribute towards the growth, towards the production of the companies. And we also have to bring a balance, because if you look at what management, the CEOs earn, it's so unfair compared to ordinary workers. And one of the issues which we're also addressing in making sure that workers can benefit, it's the skilling of workers, Karima. I must tell you, it's a shock when one went to Marikana last week and you discover that workers in 2012, they still relate in Fanakalo. No language. What does it mean? Because it also means you entrap workers perpetually in the mining industry where they can move and move to other sectors. It's completely wrong. That must change. Illiteracy must be eradicated. ABET, which we agreed to, must be there vigorously. And we will make sure that it changes. Unless you change the situation which creates mobility for those individual workers, you'll find workers being entrapped in the mining environment where they don't have a choice. We must create a choice for workers.
Now, Minister, you said that you've set timelines. Now, often what happens is that, say, for example, the timeline is, in the future. We wait until that timeline comes and goes, and then we find out that there's no compliance. Are you going to build in mechanisms to actually monitor progress toward implementation?
In fact, I must say that definitely we're not looking at 2014, because then we discover nothing has happened. My department right now, they're putting up mechanisms of a review, which will make sure to say whether there's progress or not. If there's no progress, why there's no progress, and address it then, so that when we reach 2014, we understand what are the issues, but also you can really have qualitative progress, because that's another issue. You can't have quantitative progress and say that's progress. That's not what we want. We want to see real products quantitatively, where you know that it's sustainable, where you see people changing, where any mine worker can decide and say, I'm tired, I want to join a different industry, and the person is skilled to move on with their lives. So that's the type of qualitative change of workers' lives which we want to bring on board. The issue of them participating with municipalities, it's part of the amendments of the Act, because we want to make sure beyond the life of a mine, people can continue living. One of the challenges which we face currently, precisely because of the entrapment of mine workers, they are migrant workers, they're maintaining 2 homes, which is quite difficult.
Minister, you said that you want to make amendments to the current Act. What is the time frame on those amendments? When are we likely to see those amendments changing?
Well, I had hoped by now they will be in the public space, but I am positive that in the next coming fortnight, they'll be out in the public space, approved by a cabinet, where every person in South Africa will have an opportunity to comment, which then will pull on board and then come up with our final Act. I am positive that the first quarter of next year will be having an amended Act, which then will strengthen some of the areas and say, if people are not compliant, what is it that we need to do?
Just take me through. So if we're amending the Act, what are we going to do? Are we having a white paper, then a green paper? How does the amendment actually work, and how does the public get to interface with what's in the amendment?
Well, currently we've gone to various communities where we had public hearings as the department. So the next process, we are at the stage of the cabinet. We submitted initially, they said we do some bit of amendments. We're doing with it. 1, what's going to happen is that we're going to have a government gazette. 2, we take it to the parliamentary process through the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee, which will convene various public hearings, and it will visit various communities, call all interested parties to come and make their submissions. When they conclude, it comes back to the department, where then we must factor in views raised by different people, amendments to the Act. We're not going green paper or white paper. It's the amendments where we think that there are gaps. For instance, the issue of mineral rights, there were some challenges around that particular issue. We're sorting that out. Not only that, we're also considering some of the judgments which were made by the Constitutional Court so as to align the Act itself. So those are some of the amendments which will be put in place. And I decided that we need radical changes. So let's allow, instead of piecemeal approach, reopen the Act for public comments, and on the basis of that, it will allow us to get the views. And I think this process also is an eye-opener for all of us to say whether this industry is transforming or not. So these are some of the factors which will be built into the Act. I'm alive and aware that of the Benchmark Foundation, what they're proposing, but I must say, we had already put in place those issues. We had recognized that there are gaps in the Act. We must also be mindful that this Act, when it was created at the time where there were a lot of tensions in 1996 to 98, and there were a lot of skepticism, mistrust amongst the parties. And we've gone through a transitional period. Where we are now, I am positive that we are ready to be much more open-minded, but also we are ready to recognize the gaps within the Act. Marikana, it's a typical expression of a gap in the Act itself. So we need to strengthen that, not because we want to be punitive, but we want to make sure it becomes a legislative framework which allows and grows the industry, but not only that, brings credibility to the sector and brings credibility to everyone who's in the sector and for investors to come into South Africa in a way that will say, South Africa indeed, it is an investor friendly, it is an investor destination. It is clear, you know, when you go to South Africa as an investor, what to expect. So these are some of the issues we're dealing with.
Minister, the Commission of Inquiry that the President has established is also going to look into the work that you are doing as a department, among other things, the police, the conduct of the unions, the individual strikers, all of that. Are you personally going to be participating in the Commission of Inquiry? Are you going to go and give evidence in front of it?
Well, we would like to make our submission, as I say, because nothing is cast in stone. We'll also have to assist the Commission to understand the jurisdiction we're operating in. If they subpoena us, but we also want to volunteer to submit information, which will assist the Commission to understand the history of the mining industry, the context, the Lonmin matter. Why do we find ourselves having this problem? We must also bear in mind, violence in the mining industry, it's not new. It has a history. So you can't deal with Marikana in isolation of the history of various violence occurrences within the mining sector. We really have to go into the core of why, when there are issues which can be easily resolved, the mining industry end up with such violence, losing so many souls. So these are some of the issues which are key. For us, it's important to go and really submit in assisting, and for us to say this should never happen again in South Africa.
Minister, you said violence is part of what characterizes the brutal history of mining in South Africa. So is police violence. There's been a lot of outcry that the police's reaction to the miners, whether they were armed with machetes or pangas or not, was disproportionate. What is your personal view? Should the police have used live ammunition on those workers?
Well, I cannot comment on saying whether they should have or should not have. What is critical and key for us, it's South Africa. As a country, we need to respect life, wholly. Because the bottom line is that police are human beings. As I say that the history of violence in South Africa, we've got to deal with that. From whatever quotas it comes from, we have to address it. Because if we don't, and deal with issues at face value, we will not be able to get to the core. We must look at South Africa broadly. We look at what happens in our communities. There's too much violence going on. Let's look at the brutality against women. You know, this is the Women's Month. We should be treating women differently, but to check the number of brutality which has happened to women, it shows there's a bigger problem and a challenge as a society in South Africa, where violence tends to come in many shapes and many formats. So I would say this Marikana issue comes within that context of a country where one would ask himself or herself, have we healed from the past?